support this bill to the House.
The Honourable Ruth Dyson.
Mr Speaker, it's with some disappointment actually that I join my colleagues in the Labour and Green parties to oppose the progress of this legislation, because it is certainly an area where strong legislative protection was needed, and this bill tragically, despite huge efforts from various parties around the House and from those with expertise in this area from outside our Parliament, have really tried hard. I'm disappointed that the Minister failed to take the opportunity of being a new Minister in this portfolio. She's not a brand new Minister, she's been a Minister for a little while, but in this environmental portfolio she was very new, in fact inherited this legislation. And she therefore had a huge opportunity to say, well, I'm new in this job, I can take a step back, have a look, see what the submissions to this bill have said, see what the other parties are saying, see what the experts from around New Zealand and internationally are saying, see what our international commitments are and how this legislation fits, and then just say, well, we haven't quite got it right. And there are a few amendments that could be made, and actually that would have resulted in the whole of Parliament supporting this legislation, which I think would have been not only a good thing for the process and the outcome of the legislation itself, but it would have sent a very strong message from the New Zealand Parliament about the way we consider our EEZ and continental shelf should be treated. But no, the Minister, unfortunately, and I don't understand why she did this, because it doesn't seem to me to be her normal approach, she just really refused to engage in constructive engagement on the flaws in this debate and instead bowled ahead with it. So, Mr Speaker, on that basis, and as I say with some disappointment, I'll be voting against this legislation along with my Labour colleagues, and I know the Green Party as well. We opposed this legislation at the first reading, and that was quite a big debate we had, because some of us held out great hope that there would be enough changes made at the Select Committee and through the Committee of the House on this legislation that we would be in a position to support it. But actually, in the end, those who said no, it is so fundamentally flawed when it was first brought before the House have been proven to be right. You know, it's a missed opportunity, and with something as important as this, it's really a puzzle. I know it's a puzzle to the submitters to this legislation. It's a puzzle as to why ministers don't not just take the opportunity to get it right, but take the opportunity to make themselves look better than they actually may appear. Have they not taken that opportunity? I frankly don't understand it. So, Mr Speaker, we agree that a strong legislative framework is needed to regulate and manage the activities that are undertaken in the EEZ and in the continental shelf. This doesn't provide adequate protection for the environment. We heard during the first stages of this bill this tedious mantra from the government, which I hope has been changed now with the Minister's SOP, but this tedious mantra about having to balance protection of the environment with economic development. Well, Mr Speaker, sometimes you've got to do a little more than that. Sometimes you have to have a principled approach. You have to say some things are so important that despite being able to make money, despite being able to benefit economically for usually a small number of people, despite even quite a big opportunity for economic development, we say that the destruction of our conservation or our environment is so important that we will forego that opportunity. There is no such thing as balance if you're talking about destruction. So I was delighted to see that tired, oft-repeated mantra being put to bed by the Minister's SOP, and she has taken a slightly more tentative step forward than she may have, but at least a step forward in saying there may be some environmental bottom lines that we think are beyond the balancing approach. So I want to commend her for that. But when this bill was first introduced, that's all we heard. we can't have environmental protection as the fundamental frame for this bill, and in fact it didn't have environmental protection really obvious as an outcome that was desired, let alone required as part of the legislation. So, Mr Speaker, if you talk about fundamental flaws, that had to be one. If the bill's aim is to have environmental protection for the EEZ and continental shelf, but that isn't the purpose and the outcome required of the legislation, one would assume a slightly fundamental flaw. Now, what's the reason that we were so supportive of this regulatory framework? Well, it's really obvious that there's an increasing interest in oil and gas exploration in New Zealand, and the most important thing, therefore, is to have a really robust framework, one that's been well considered, has the different perspectives put into it, but one that says our environmental protection is fundamental, we do not want to put it at risk. There are some types of exploration that we would warmly welcome. There are many parts of New Zealand we'd warmly welcome it in, but without that framework of protection, one that the industry is really clear about and one that the enforcers of the legislation are really clear about, then we're doomed for disaster. We've already had enough near risks, near misses in New Zealand. We've seen some devastating outcomes from incidents overseas where they have not had that strong not just framework, but understanding of the framework and enforcement of the framework. So, Mr Speaker, that's a very good reason why we needed this legislative framework, because we know that there's an increasing interest in both oil exploration and gas exploration in New Zealand. So it's not just the industry and the enforcers that need that framework. In my view, every single member of the public of New Zealand, our citizens, need to have the confidence that if applications are put in for this sort of exploration, that we have the robust framework for consideration of that application, and then if something goes wrong, we have clear liabilities, we have clear responses to deal with any incidents that happen. It seemed to me that this government quite sadly demonstrated once again that it knows the price of everything but the value of nothing. And that is really quite an opposition to the way that most New Zealanders feel about the parts of our country that are most special to us, the parts of our land and of our sea that are most special to us, let alone the potential damage that can be done to one of our major industries, and that's the fishing industry. It didn't seem to have any weight to bear on the consideration when this bill was first drafted. Mr Speaker, as I mentioned earlier, we had hoped that the Minister would be open to working constructively with us on this legislation and making amendments that would provide the robust framework that I mentioned that we need so desperately, and I'm really disappointed that she doesn't. I hope that as she gains confidence in her environmental portfolio, she will have the ability to stretch across the political divide and work with members of other parties, because actually all of us have constructive ideas. We don't always agree with each other. That's fairly obvious, otherwise we'd all be in one great middle-of-the-road political party, but we do have constructive ideas to offer. And when they're done with an agreed outcome, then I would think that it would be better off for this Parliament if the Minister would engage with us in the future. So we lodged 6 supplementary order papers, and I want to commend my colleagues who did that. Every single one of those 6 SOPs was voted down by the government. We put the preservation of the environment as the primary principal obligation in this legislation. How could you vote against that? We made sure that there would be no doubt that the legislation would comply with our international obligations. We ensured that the cautious approach that's advocated in this bill would be replaced by the widely recognised precautionary approach. There doesn't seem to be anything in those supplementary order papers, Mr Speaker, that a thinking person could vote against, and yet every single member of the government voted against our 6 SOPs. Mr Speaker, had those SOPs and the other amendments the Minister has proposed all been included, we may have been able to rethink our position and support it. That would have been my preference. So again, I say it's with great disappointment that the Minister and this bill have fallen well short of the mark, and I'll be voting against it.
Maggie Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.